So I will be presenting on the book Dog Whistle Politics, How Coded Racial Appeals Have Reinvented Racism and Wrecked the Middle Class by Ian Hanley Lopez. Ian Hanley Lopez is a law professor at UC Berkeley with a focus on racial justice. That's what he teaches. He is a contemporary of President Obama. They overlapped in high school in Hawaii, as well as being students together at Harvard Law School. Dog Whistle Politics was a very interesting book because of how it plays when it was published, as well as how it plays in the current political climate. The book begins and ends with the author talking about Derek Bell. The idea for this book came out of a lecture that he gave at the Derek Bell it's a memorial lecture now, but when he gave it, it wasn't a memorial lecture yet. Derek Bell was a professor that he studied under, and Bell's ideas, his main thesis in his book, which was called Faces at the Bottom of the Well, was black people will never receive full equality in this country. He used this idea of a space invader theory, which was if space invaders came from space and offered the United States the cure to cancer and unlimited wealth, but the caveat was that they had to enslave black people again, the United States would do it without a second thought. When he was a student, Hanley Lopez disagreed with that because he's like, there's no way, we've come so far. The focus of this book is how he came to the conclusion over the course of his life that this was not the case and that Derek Bell was correct in his conclusions. The book focuses on the idea of coded language. And there's a heavy focus on the GOP's use of coded language. Coded language it's the idea of a dog whistle, where it's, to some people, you don't hear it, it's completely inaudible, but to certain groups, you can hear it loud and clear. He focuses more on the racial aspects of it and how it is used in political life. He narrows it down to racial appeal. It worked to turn white people against liberal government. He uses a lot of examples in terms of the New Deal and how over the course from the 1960s to the 1990s, how there was a flip in terms of support of the New Deal from everybody to white people seeing it as something that they deserved but was being used undeservedly by minorities. So the book is separated mostly by decades, with two notable exceptions. The focus is on presidents and various politicians. The only two politicians who receive their own chapters are Ronald Reagan and President Obama. President Obama received his own chapter because this book was written in 2014 in the aftermath of the 2012 election, where there was a shift from the 2008 election. And Ronald Reagan receives his own chapter because he kind of completely flipped the switch in terms of how racially coded language was used. The first politician he focuses on is George Wallace. He uses the example that George Wallace used to be a racial moderate in air quotes, where he was still a racist, but he was not as racist as some of his contemporaries. When he ran for governor in 1958, George Wallace was endorsed by the NAACP. But because he was endorsed by the NAACP, he lost the governorship. And George Wallace made that choice. He was like, oh, clearly I cannot win if I am a racial moderate. I have to go hardcore. He ran as a racial reactionary 4 years later, and he won. And he used this idea that Hanley Lopez focuses on, where it's called, what is it? It's strategic racism, which is racism that is used, it's a purposeful effort to use racial animus as leverage to gain material wealth or political power. And that is kind of what he focuses on, is that it is most racial and coded language that is used by politicians is used as a way to gain political power. Not necessarily out of support of those beliefs, but out of the need to gain votes, as George Wallace did, and as Barry Goldwater did, who also used to be a racial moderate but voted against the Civil Rights Act in 1964. and also kind of gave way to this idea of racially coded language. He also embraced dog whistle politics and also embraced the new national Southern strategy, because George Wallace came to the conclusion in 1964 that that the United States, they all hate black people, all of them. They're all afraid, all of them. Great God, that's it. They're all Southern. The entire United States is Southern, which shifted the Southern strategy of, focus on the white people to the entire country and focus in on those things that white people felt that they deserved. So with the strategic racism, it kind of played into that dog whistle racism, where it was coded language kind of filled in the gaps. In the 1980s, it kind of came to a head with Ronald Reagan. In one of his campaign speeches, he talked about welfare queens driving Cadillacs in a way to describe how, without saying it bluntly, he was implying that minorities were overusing the social services system without actually saying it, which is what the coded language was. He almost crossed the line, because the whole thing with coded language, and is that you can't explicitly say the racist thing, but you can imply it all the way up to the line. Reagan almost crossed the line, where at another campaign speech he talked about strapping young bucks getting a T-bone in front of getting a T-bone steak while you're getting hamburger. That almost crossed the line. It was reported in a couple newspapers, and so when he regave the speech about a week later, he changed it to some young fellow in order to go back on the coded language and keep himself from crossing that racial line, because politics had moved ahead enough that you knew not to say the racist thing, but you could say everything up to it. George H.W. Bush, when he ran in the 1990s, did a similar thing. He did not focus on the race issue, but he pointed out the race issue. He was running against a guy named Michael Dukakis, who was leading in the polls. Bush had not done any coded racial appeals up until that point. He wanted to do a clean campaign until Michael Dukakis pulled ahead as the election was coming closer. So he released an ad about a guy named Willie Horton, who was a prisoner in Massachusetts, who had been released on furlough and raped a woman and stabbed her boyfriend multiple times. He ran an ad displaying this, saying, "Do you want somebody who releases somebody like this onto the streets as president?" George H.W. Bush won the election. He was not elected for a second term due to a myriad of factors. But Bill Clinton, despite Hanley Lopez's affection for Bill Clinton, he used the same appeals, mostly in terms of, he described himself as a new Democrat, where he wasn't as focused on the rights of minorities, but he still cared enough about the rights of minorities in order to gain their votes. But it was interesting how in his run-up to the election, he used a similar tactic to Bush, where he attended the execution of a man named Ricky Ray Rector, who had a lobotomy before he was executed, but they still executed him. But he wanted to show that he wasn't soft on crime. Bill Clinton also passed the controversial 3 strikes law, which was also seen as, a more trying to continue to receive the white vote. This continued through his administration. For George Bush, I thought it was interesting that he did focus on the idea that at the beginnings of George Bush's presidency, he did not use coded language. He was, you could arguably say, pro-minority. He was beginning to pass laws that would, or he had recommended legislation that would limit the amount of mass incarceration, and then 9/11 happened. At this point, you see the shift from just coded language towards African Americans, towards African Americans, undocumented immigrants, and Muslims. The target shifts. You see the shift in coded language from stuff like welfare queens and strapping young bucks to, illegal immigrants, illegal alien, the use of the word Sharia as a buzzword to scare people. It's a scare tactic, and it worked. It focused middle-class white voters' attentions away from what the GOP was doing at the time, which was essentially siphoning away their money to give tax breaks to the 1%. Hanley points out that the overall, the average income of a middle-class American went down from the 1970s going from the 1970s. It went up during the Carter administration until the economic collapse, went down during the Reagan administration, went back up during Bush, or went back up during Clinton, and then went back down during the Bush administration. Mostly due to this use of, you use the coded language in order to scare people. When it came to Obama, he focused on this idea that President Obama had a lost opportunity to do what he had promised in his campaign. He brought up that idea that people say, oh, President Obama never had a chance to do anything because he was locked and loaded from the start with the Republican majority. He points out that at the beginning of President Obama's presidency, the Republican Party was in shambles. You had somebody like Sarah Palin who did not understand the concept of a coded racial appeal and just went straight for it, which kind of destroyed the Republican Party. But he did not seize on that opportunity and created the rise of the Tea Party, which was a more blatant idea of, it's opposed big government, but not Social Security and the things that they benefited from. The Tea Party is overwhelmingly white, and they resented the sense that their taxes were being wasted on undeserving minorities. But he talks about how Fox News has become, the king of coded racial appeals. They did have a heavy focus on the Tea Party. They talk about Sharia law all the time like it's invading Cleveland. And how they have shifted to this idea of now it's, as my colleague was talking about earlier, it's the idea of like voter suppression and how President Obama stole the election. And they're now focusing on this voter suppression. They make new laws. They focus on, the illegal aliens that are stealing votes, who are stealing Social Security. And it's caused by this common sense racism that's formed by social environment. He uses the example of The Wire as being the first show that humanizes people, and it doesn't just show, drug dealers doing bad things, but it shows them as people. And how other TV shows who just show the negative effects destroy this idea. The strengths of this book were just how much information was given and the way that it was presented. It was organized beautifully, and it kind of created a narrative that worked. It read almost like a news article, but far more interesting. The downsides, I would say, is that he talks about briefly in his introduction how coded language was used on both sides, but he only briefly mentions how it's used in the modern-day Democratic Party. He does talk about how it was used in the Democratic Party when it was still run by the Southern Democrats of the 1950s and 60s, but he doesn't really talk about how it's used in the modern-day Democrats, other than a brief mention every once in a while. The most interesting thing that I pulled out of this book wasn't something that was actually mentioned in the book. The book was published in 2014 after President Obama's 2012 election, and at the end of the book he talks about what the future of coded language is in the political sphere. He doesn't know where it's going to go, but he knows that at some point it has to evolve. Mm-hmm. I thought it was interesting to see that in comparison of how it did evolve and that it devolved from what it was. Coded language is no longer a thing anymore, as evidenced by the 2016 campaign as run by President Trump. He clearly does not understand the concept of coded language and just goes straight for it, much like Sarah Palin did, which kind of cost John McCain the election. So it was interesting to see how that played out, and I would be curious to see what he says in the aftermath of that election on how that would maybe change his ideas on how coded language evolves, because it devolved and it's almost in the similar place to where it was when George Wallace was running. But overall, it was a good book. I thought it was wonderfully written, and it's a lot to take in. I'd recommend it to anybody who regularly watches Fox News. so that they understand kind of what they're hearing, because all of it is just, you hear what you want to hear. Questions? Yeah.
I have a question.
Sure.
So you just equated the lack of understanding of code language between Trump and Palin, but attributed that with Palin as to losing the election for McCain. But after reading this book, do you feel like you could comment on why it was effective and successful for Trump?
I think it was successful for Trump because of the rise of things like the Tea Party, where he talks about how people rejected Mitt Romney because he towed the line, but he didn't toe the line the way that he was supposed to. He talks about the 47% comment that he made, I think it was like 3 months before the election happened. And I think it was the people who voted for President Trump saw it as a return to that lack of caring. And
so a stage was set.
Yeah, a stage was set. I think it was, you saw it with Ronald Reagan. That was kind of the first crescendo. You saw it when coded language kind of shifted from this vague language to, outright, when you talk about Sharia, you know exactly who you're talking about. When you're talking about a welfare queen, there's some nuances that could be there. But if you're talking about Sharia law, you damn know well what's talking about.
Okay, I think we're done with time.
Cool.
Thank you. And we'll just wait a second so we get the recording completed.
Oh, it was fantastic.